Thanks for staying with us here on WION. We've been bringing you non-stop and in-depth coverage of what's going on in China and, of course, in Korea as well. Our attention for now, though, focusing on the summit in Wuhan. It's been called an informal summit, but there is a delegation that's accompanying both the Indian Prime Minister and the Chinese President. They are engaging in talks even as we speak. But the big takeaway from all of this has been the stress on maintaining channels of communication between the two countries. Joining me in the studio right now is a former Indian diplomat Arun Singh, who's served in many countries and is with us on the broadcast, giving us his perspective on what's going on in Wuhan. Ambassador Singh, thank you for making time for WION once again. So again, we go back to what the end game, or perhaps the big takeaway from all of this. We'll get into the brass tacks in a while, but to start off with, just going by the fact that Prime Minister Modi has said that, he's open to having informal summits as often as every year, just goes to show that there is a lot to be taken away from this summit.
No, absolutely. And as some have commented, even when you have formal summits, very often within the structure of that, a time is set aside for a one-to-one or a restricted meeting between the leaders. And the idea is that in that framework, they can have a more candid conversation to set the tone for the other discussion. Now, in this meeting, deliberately, I think it was kept an informal summit because there are protocol aspects. The Indian Prime Minister had visited China in September 2015. He was also there for the BRICS summit in Sherman last year.
Yes.
He's likely to be going to the SCO event in June. And the Chinese president had come here only in 2014. Therefore, for an Indian Prime Minister to make another formal visit at this time would have been protocol-wise a little difficult. And then a formal visit also raises expectations in terms of what are you going to put in the joint statement, what are the agreements, what is the outcome. So you finesse all that by saying it's an informal summit.
Right.
And it's going to be essentially an interaction at the level of leaders, although, as you saw, there is a delegation level meeting going on right now. And so the message is that this summit is being used to change the tone of the relationship. It had become a bit adversarial over the past 1 year and set a new context for discussions and interactions in the coming period.
Right.
And certainly the Prime Minister himself over the last 3-4 years has put a lot of emphasis on his one-to-one interaction with other world leaders.
He has, yes.
And therefore his saying that he's happy to do informal summits as often as required would very much fit into that pattern.
Absolutely. And of course, speaking of, this meeting, it has come almost at the apex of a number of initiatives undertaken by both sides. I'm talking about high-level visits that have been made from the Indian side. Vijay Gokhale making his way across, also, of course, Sushma Swaraj, Nirmala Sitharaman very recently, and of course from the Chinese side as well, we have seen high-level delegations coming to India. So even though this is an informal summit, the work, really speaking, that's been going on behind the scenes has been concerted, it has been regular.
Absolutely. So a lot of work clearly has gone on behind the scenes. A lot of preparation has taken place behind the scenes. Although many of the visits that happened, for example, the visit of our foreign minister and of our defense minister, took place in the context of meetings of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Right.
So they went for the SCO foreign ministers meeting, SCO defense ministers meeting. But on the margins of that, they also had bilateral meetings.
They did, yes.
And again, it shows the importance also of multilateral frameworks. That sometimes when bilateral interactions are difficult, the multilateral framework gives you an opportunity to meet and address issues. For example, in the context of Doklam, while the challenge was still on, the two countries had differences. Our Prime Minister had met on the margins the Chinese President on the margins of G20 in Hamburg. And a lot of people have pointed out it was following that meeting that the resolution process started for Doklam. So these multilateral events, meetings in that framework, bilateral meetings on the margins of those are very important. And that enabled India, without really signaling that we are sending a whole set of people one after the other, to have a series of meetings which were no doubt used also to prepare for this.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Ambassador Singh. We've also got more guests joining our panel this afternoon to talk about that summit. Andrew KP Loom joins us from Hong Kong. With us from New Delhi is Brahma Chellaney. Gentlemen, thank you for making time to speak with us here at WION. Andrew, to you first, how exactly is this visit being perceived in China, in Hong Kong? Kong? How is Asia at large really looking at the way this entire summit has unfolded, even though it is being called informal?
Well, as pointed out, there are also opportunities for the two leaders to meet very shortly in June, for example. So the question is that why now? Why the urgency? Why all of a sudden so many high-level visits? I think that this is explained by the realization that world dynamics have changed quite rapidly, and then the world is becoming much more integrated and interdependent, and it's no longer the kind of old mantra of either you're with me or against me or forming into blocks. And of course, all countries are rivals in a certain way. All countries are competitive, but also there are rooms to look at areas for cooperation. So I think that this offers an urgent opportunity for both sides to narrow differences and to understand each other's intentions, because it's always the miscalculation that sets the tone or a kind of vicious circle. So I think that this is a very good opportunity, and an informal environment. Don't get a lot of controversial issues in the past, whether it's China, the European Union, or the trade war or something. It's usually in a kind of fashion preceded or integrated with some sort of formal setting, because the informal setting, can
allow me to come in, Andrew. We're losing your voice there. Let's try and fix that connection and come back to you in a second. In the meantime, Brahma Chellaney, this entire meeting, of course, we have to look at it in the context of the fact, as Andrew was pointing out, there is a trade war that is looming between the United States and China. There have been global developments, perhaps, that have sort of eased the process along. Would it be fair to say that?
Certainly, but let's not forget that there has been no dearth of opportunity for India and China to engage in serious discussion. Prime Minister Modi has been to China 4 times already. This is his 4th visit. And in terms of meeting President Xi Jinping, this is the 13th occasion since Modi came to power when he has met with Xi Jinping. So there have been a series of dialogues, meetings, discussions that have been taking place. And let us not forget that this is not the first time that Prime Minister Modi is seeking to reset relations with China. The last attempt by Modi in September 2014 produced a very different result. It produced the opposite result. It led to deterioration in relations between the two countries. In fact, President Xi Jinping came to India with a Chinese military incursion into Chumar and Ladakh. So, we are hyping this current effort and forgetting the context. We're forgetting the larger context. We're forgetting the fact that a number of efforts have been made in the last 4 years to improve relations between the two countries, and those efforts have failed to take off. In fact, China's behavior has become more aggressive, and let's not forget that Mr. Modi has gone to China this time with a weakened hand, because in the last 8 months or so, China has occupied much of Doklam Plateau. India stood up to China last summer in June, July, and August. But after the Chinese agreed to mutually disengage from the standoff site, the PLA troops came in quietly and over the winter occupied much of Doklam. That's one. The other is that the trade deficit of India with China has doubled on Modi's watch. It has gone from $2.5 billion a month to $5 billion a month currently. Now that undercuts India's leverage, because if you can't rein in the spiraling trade deficit, you undermine your leverage and your negotiating position.
All right, stay with me, Brahma Chellaney and Andrew KP Loom. Ambassador Singh, of course, there's been this sort of effervescence, if you will, about this meeting. There's been a lot of positive coverage, definitely, about Prime Minister Modi and President Xi's meeting. But we can't take away from the fact that there are facts, as Brahma Chellaney pointed out for us. Do you think that the other, contention of all of this has been that the Prime Minister is working very strategically with his eye on the general elections of 2019. He is consolidating his position in many ways, keeping that in mind. Do you think the two can be married, and that is perhaps an attempt that the Prime Minister is undertaking right now?
So I think while the objective difficulties remain, be it on the border, the Chinese postures on the border, the trade issues, and also China's growing footprint in the region around us, in South Asia, in the Indian Ocean, in Sri Lanka, Nepal, Maldives, the role they've been playing. They're looking at Gwadar in Pakistan. So those are certainly factors. But at the same time, since 1988, our effort has been that while we have differences, we should continue to expand the overall levels of cooperation in the relationship so that it enables us to tackle the differences more easily. And the last some time, you hear officials saying repeatedly that we should not allow our differences to become disputes.
Right.
So while the differences are there and one should not overlook them, at the same time we have to continue to make an effort to see if a new framework for cooperation can also be worked out. And repeatedly that effort has been made. It was done in 1988, but when Rajiv Gandhi went there. It was done in 2003 when Prime Minister Vajpayee went to China. And I think it is again being attempted that given the difficulties we had and sharp difficulties over the past year, which is not helpful. Because if we have very, very strong adversarial relationship with China playing out openly, others will take advantage.
Which is what I was going to ask you. Do you think that this, this situation of competition between India and China has also foisted itself on the relationship and perhaps has caused a narrowing of the opportunities of cooperation, genuine cooperation?
So the competition is inevitable.
Right.
I mean, we are neighbors. We are both growing powers. At the same time, I recall that when our Prime Minister had gone to China in May 2015, the joint statement had said, the leaders agreed that simultaneous re-emergence of India and China as two major powers in the region and the world offers a momentous opportunity for realization of the Asian century. Similar sentiments were also expressed by former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh.
Right.
So that's one of the objectives they try to build. But at the same time, competition is inevitable. We are neighboring countries. There are similarities. We are both growing powers. We will both be looking for additional space. But for us, the challenge today is that China's GDP is 5 times India's GDP. The military expenditure is several times India's military expenditure. That has enabled them to have a presence in the Indian Ocean and around us, which they did not have earlier. And we'll have to deal with that. We can't just overlook it. So as that is happening and as the global situation is in flux, relations, US relations with other countries, US-Europe relations with Russia, we have to see how do we play the India-China equation in that context so that we maximize our options. And again, multipolarity in our relationships is something that we have always worked for because that gives us more space for our strategic autonomy. So that remains important.
And something we've seen demonstrated repeatedly in the last year, the multipolarity, this, sticking to this whole plan of not forming or becoming part of blocs is something that we've seen as part of concerted policy. Ambassador Singh, if I can also ask you in that same breath, when we're looking at the relationship between these two Asian giants, that's a moniker that's often used for India and China. Do you think that what's happening today is also a sign of maturity in the relationship? That there has been an acceptance that, CPEC, BRI, the NSG factor, the Masood Azhar factor, the relationship between China and Pakistan, these are going to be sticking points between the two countries, but there's an acceptance of them and yet a moving forward.
So I would hesitate to use the word maturity, but clearly the relationship has evolved. I was looking at the kind of joint statements that we have issued since 1988. So in 1988, it was a very basic, bare bones joint statement. It was the first meeting taking place after 1962. Since then, at different meetings, the text of the joint statement has expanded.
Right.
Because it reflects growing levels of bilateral cooperation and also different global issues that we are discussing, working on, be it trade, climate change, terrorism, and other aspects. So clearly, with all this, the relationship has evolved. The levels of discussion on different issues are more intense. There are frequent levels of interaction, as you refer to both visits. But I don't know whether we've really reached a maturity, because the very frequent problems we run into, as we did over the past year, would suggest that we have a lot of work still to do. So I think clearly I would say that the attempt being made now is perhaps a mature way to address the challenge that we face.
Okay.
But going ahead, let us see how it evolves.
Okay. Andrew, KP Loom and Brahma Chellaney are also with us on the broadcast. Andrew, I think, we've all come to the consensus, of course, that India and China are competitors. They are two emerging economies, strong economies that, do hold a certain global sway as well. But going by the fact that, there have been many skirmishes in the relationship of late, would it be fair also to say that there was really no place for this relationship to go than up, given the depths that it had fallen to following Doklam?
Yes, I think that that's why it's important to set the tone. If the tone is confrontational, then there is a vicious spiral down. But if the atmosphere is more positive, then some of the differences could be set aside, even if they cannot be resolved. And then both sides can look for areas for cooperation. And that feeds into a virtuous cycle. So I think that's very, very important to set the tone, but both sides need to understand each other's intentions very, very clearly. This is a moment which is very, very different, of course, from 1988, because China is now the second largest economy, and it's pointed out, it's much more influential, and as well as India, and both are poised to play a more important role in a very complicated and interconnected world, especially with a new administration and in the United States as the world superpower. And then the rise of China has now rocking the boat, and then disturbing the existing international order in more ways than one. And of course, it is not intentional. This is by virtue of the fact of the sheer size of China's economy and the connectivity of the economy. So I think how to manage this transition, as it were, with the rise of China. And of course, India is as an independent country. It doesn't want to be a pipe in other nations' fingers to sound what stop the other nations' pleases, because it has its own agenda, its own strategy. And then the opportunity arises for India to work to see how it can work with China to manage this very complicated external international situation, which is becoming clearer and clearer by the day. And that's why there's more urgency now. And so that's why Prime Minister Modi has been making repeated visits to China, in spite of the fact that the two sides can have more opportunities to meet in the not distant future. So I think there's a degree of urgency for both countries to understand each other much more clearly and to seek out areas for cooperation and how to manage not only the bilateral relationship, but the role of both India and China in this integrated and changing world order.
Absolutely. Changing order, definitely, especially since certain President Trump has made his way into the White House. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll request all three of you to stay on with us because at a time when, of course, India and China are engaging in this summit in Wuhan. These are, of course, remember, the heads of two big Asian economies. The two countries are coming together for talks, but the Indian industry has put forward its expectations from this informal meet. The industry captains say that as China is heavily subsidizing its goods and even sometimes selling them below cost, India must demand a level playing field for its goods and services in China, as Indo-China trade is highly skewed in favor of China. As far as on Prime Minister Modi's visit to China goes, WION spoke with the President of India's trade body, the Confederation of Indian Industry, or CII. Listen in.
Well, I would say if India has to be amongst the three top economies in the world, And today we are amongst the largest emerging economy, which is growing at the fastest pace. Continuous engagement, continuous dialogue is always very good. You can resolve matters, resolve issues sitting across the table. And especially the trade wars which we are seeing, or artificial trade barriers which are being put under the protectionism, whatever we are seeing, we need to see the final outcome, how does it pan out. Though I believe this is not good, because if you see last couple of decades, the world has benefited from open global trade. But this is something we'll have to wait and see.
And there is a huge trade deficit between India and China. In fact, now we started taking this matter seriously. Just now, last month, we had a meeting between the commerce ministers of both countries. Do you think we are late in admitting this, and we are late in addressing this biggest concern we were facing from the last many years?
I think, I would say any action being taken should not be seen as late or too late. We need to appropriately support the government on inputs from the industry. And the government then needs to take necessary actions to mitigate those risks. Globally, everyone knows Chinese companies have been supplying products at much cheaper costs on account of huge hidden subsidies on the support which they get. Having said that, there needs to be a level playing field for the Indian industry as well. On the other hand, I would also say Indian industry need to and must invest to become competitive globally. I mean, if you see the auto sector, the auto parts, we are competing with the world today. So similarly, I think it's difficult for me to address all the sectors, but given that China has been pumping products at probably below cost, that's what our belief is, the government must take necessary action.
So one last question to you would be, at the same time, a big summit is happening where North and South Korea are coming together. Also now, Donald Trump, US President, and it looks like that North Korea, they both are reaching to some conclusion, or truce at least. So then this stability is here to stay, and it will be in favor of the whole global economy.
Certainly, yes. I think it is good for the region. It's good for the entire world. And I think when President Kim talked about now opening up the economic sectors for development of North Korea, I think there is an opportunity for global companies and countries to engage with them. And I only wish that we see a positive outcome on this, which can only be more productive for global economies as a whole.
All right, so thank you and wish you all the best. Thanks for giving this opportunity.